Thanks, Nick. So hello to everybody at this late afternoon on a Friday. Welcome to the NENA conference. If you haven't been to any sessions yet, this is my first one so far. So got a big weekend lined up and giving my own session on Sunday morning. I'd like to acknowledge country, of course, as we always do. I'm based in a Awabakal country and Mulabimba, otherwise known as Newcastle, which is about 2 hours and a bit north of Sydney. And I think my friend Nick is in Brisbane as well. So we're going to hear from Lisa Powell and Nick McGuigan firstly, and they've got it's a 50-minute panel session. So we've got about 15 minutes from them, and then we'll do about a 10-minute Q&A. So think of your questions as we go along, and we'll have a bit of discussion, and then we'll pass over to Christine McDougall, who will give us about a just under 25 minutes presentation, a little bit of Q&A at the end. So we will try to wrap up pretty close to on time, although we're slightly late getting started. So we'll make sure people get plenty of time to do their full presentation. I must say I'm really delighted to be sharing this session. I work around impact innovation, and I have had quite a lot of focus on procurement over the years, and I always think of things like accounting and procurement as some of those core structural, kind of often invisible at a daily level sort of processes that are really critical to either enabling or not innovation and transitions and changes. So my colleague calls it the boring revolution, but I find it absolutely fascinating, and think it's I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentations. So I'll pass over to Lisa and Nick first, and if you want to say a few words to introduce yourself more fully, that would be great, and then we'll get started.
Thanks so much, Jo. Thanks, Jo, for the introduction. I'll just share the screen. Jo, it looks like I can't share the screen.
Nick, is that something you can make our presenters co-hosts? Nick has the power.
Do you want to try that now?
Okay, that's good. Thanks
Great,
for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks, Nick. So our presentation is about rewilding accounting education for the Anthropocene, and Nick and I will be co-presenting as we go through today. Just before we start, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians. So for us, this is the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we're calling from today, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and we acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. With the PowerPoint slides that we have today, you'll see the images that we have on the background. These are photos that we have taken from a place called Sherbrooke Forest, which is not far out of Melbourne. You may have heard of it. It's a place where I love to go walking in this forest. It's really quite majestic with these mountain ash trees, which are one of the tallest trees in the world. And this project came about because Nick and I were talking about this forest in compared to accounting and how we account for things and accounting education. So we comparing the complexity of forest ecosystems to the way we account for things, which is very reductive and very standardized. So when we think about accounting in the Anthropocene, we know in the Anthropocene that we have very human-centered discourse that positions humans as central, as superior to non-human species, and very much separate to the natural environment. And we know the impacts of that in terms of climate change and so on. So if we want to think about how we as accounting educators can help to respond to these global challenges, then one thing we can do is to rethink this human-centered framework. So we're doing this in the context of accounting and also in the context of accounting education. So accounting in the Anthropocene, we know that accounting is a social construct. It's created by humans for humans. So accounting is very much financial focused. It perpetuates that distinction between humans and the natural environment, and non-human species are very rarely accounted for. And if they are accounted for, then they're commodified and they have a financial value and their value to the organisation and the humans that run the organisation, but intrinsic value is ignored and interactions with nature are ignored. So we have that separation from humans and the natural environment. So if we want to think about how we can move away from a solely human-centered focus in accounting, then one thing that we need to think about is how we educate our accounting students. So if we think about how we do that, accounting education uses the Western humanist educational model. So again, it's very human-centered. There's very little consideration of non-human species when we're educating accounting students. And there's, again, very little consideration of the natural environment. And if there is, it's all about the financial value of non-human species, such as the Sherbrooke forest, the forest systems, and non-human species such as farm animals, which are given a financial value, but no intrinsic value. So this is very much individualistic discourse that promotes student autonomy. So that's separation from nature. So there's really very little acknowledgement of the role that humans play in broader ecological systems. So what we're doing with this project is thinking about how we can move away from a solely human-centered approach, so positioning humans as central, towards an approach that positions ecological systems as central, so a greater ecocentric approach. So we want to do that and acknowledge that we have the complex interrelationships amongst humans and non-humans in the natural environment. So we draw upon the concept of rewilding, and we also use perspectives from posthumanism and ecofeminism. So we do that to present new ways of thinking in accounting education and alternative narrative, which is very different to the standardized reductive approach that we currently have in accounting education. So for the concept of rewilding, we know that it has its origins in conservation biology, talking about restoration and protection of core wilderness areas that are linked by wilderness corridors. And rewilding can be used as a metaphor of guiding. So when we're applying this to accounting education, what we're saying is we want to move away from the standardized reductive approaches that are currently used in accounting education and move towards an education that better aligns with the ecological system, acknowledges things like the intrinsic value of non-human species and the natural environment. So promotes the recognition of those complex interconnections. So in rewilding accounting education, we draw upon posthumanist perspectives and ecofeminist perspectives. And these are quite useful because if we want to move away from a solely human-centered approach, then posthumanism is useful because it presents a way of decentering the human, which is not hasn't been used in accounting before, but it's something that we need to do in acknowledging the role in broader systems. So rejecting the arrogance of human exceptionalism and acknowledging that we have a broader role to play. We also draw upon ecofeminist perspectives. And again, these are particularly useful because currently in accounting education, humans are positioned as completely separate from the natural environment. So ecofeminism challenges that notion that we are somehow separate from the environment, and it acknowledges those interconnections and the mutually reinforcing forms of oppression, so of women, non-human species, and nature by modern Western masculinity. So drawing upon posthumanist and ecofeminist perspectives helps us to rewild accounting education. So when we do this, we decenter the human, and it helps to position ecological systems at the centre rather than just humans at the centre. And that helps to develop in students a different mindset, so a more holistic mindset, a more relational orientation, and greater ecological consciousness, so that when students go on to graduate and move into the profession, they're better prepared to address the global crises that we're currently facing and to thrive in a very complex and uncertain environment. So I'll hand over to Nick now, who will talk more about the way that we do that in rewilding interventions.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks everyone so much for having us. It's great to be able to zoom in with you. As you can imagine, we are working in a mainstream business school. So what we're trying to do is obviously quite unique. It's quite experimental, and it can also be quite challenging, as Lisa can attest to as well. But what we are trying to do is really tackle that mainstream business education on its head and kind of shift it and try and twist it and play with it and experiment with it as much as we can. And Lisa makes a really good point around the notion of uncertainty, complexity, and agility. Those kind of words, obviously, we've heard right through the pandemic. We're trying to co-opt them as much as we can to work in our favor inside business schools politically, to kind of use that language to shift. Well, if you really want someone to understand complex ecosystems, they need to be exposed to complex ecosystems rather than the business school environments and classrooms. So on that note, we devised these kind of, or took from the literature, these 4 ecopedagogies that to our knowledge have never been used, at least inside a business school before. There are some disciplines that have used these concepts before, but not necessarily inside a business school. So firstly, looking at learning with and from nature, that's kind of our first one. We really wanted to put students inside nature, and we wanted to use nature as a teacher as much as we are as the educators. So Lisa, if we could flick to the next slide, that would be great. With that notion, I have struggled for years to get students to understand a conceptual framework. It's so abstract, it's so well beyond an 18 or 19-year-old's mind around why we have that and what purpose it serves. And so we always found when we were educating in accounting that they could do the technique very easily or well after a period of time, but we weren't necessarily able to understand why that was the case or why we would have a standardized approach right across the world. So rather than giving the students the conceptual framework, we wanted them to first of all understand the complexity of a system for a start. So we took them to a permaculture garden on campus here at Clayton. And that was about 3 years ago, four years ago now we started to do that. And we wanted them to hear from a permaculturist that it would explain what an ecosystem actually does, the very complex relationships and interactions that are occurring across the ecosystem. And then, of course, we can use that as a nice metaphorical introduction to a conceptual framework, that actually when you do have an accounting system inside an organization, there are many, many transactions or relationships that you have to account for. The problem we have in our current society is we've got an accounting system that only really accounts for the kind of economic transactions rather than all of the interrelationships, although that's changing. So this was using nature was a really nice way to get students to conceptually understand the complexity of a system, but also use that as a mirror to view accounting as a system rather than a technique. And so that was really kind of critical. So that was one of the first techniques we used. The second was looking at drawing upon our Indigenous perspectives and knowledge. And here we were really trying to think about this holistic system, this relational system, but also the practicalities of Indigenous business in Australia. For example, Indigenous-owned businesses operate with a co-CEO governance. So it's much more collaborative. So we wanted to get individuals into the classroom that are working within Indigenous businesses as CEOs, that they can explain that kind of collaborative, co-relational model, that actually when one organization needs assistance, rather than going to a third party like a banking institution, they will work and collaborate with each other to help each other out. And so it was about trying to give that kind of perspective, which was quite different to what we're used to, where we usually take a first-year student and we only expose them to the corporation or the company environment. It's very rare nowadays in business schools to hear about cooperatives and other forms of working models of organizations, unless it's entrepreneurial, profit-driven, or main multinational organizations. So it was trying to give a different perspective in that respect. The third example was looking at play. Now, we know from an education perspective, the most amount of learning a human ever does is in their kindergarten years when they're playing. So ultimate freedom to play and to explore is when the mind is working the most, and it's capturing the most amount of knowledge and storing that kind of information. So for some reason in our education system, we strip play as much as we can out of it throughout the education process. So by the time we get to university, at least in accounting programs, it's very rare that a student would be given the opportunity to play. And what we mean by play is really play with each other using creative resources. So we've used Play-Doh, for example, where we want students to kinetically grow something, create something. It's very rare that that's done inside our program. So we wanted to bring the play concept back but we wanted to do that with a critical perspective in accounting. So what we wanted to ask our students to look at was the language that we use in one of our international accounting standards. Now, I'm not going to bore you, but it's the agricultural accounting standard. The way that we speak about biological assets, as something we dominate as humans, we wanted to explore that language of our conceptual framework. And then we took our students to a farm sanctuary just outside Melbourne, and we started to get them to explore those biological assets that are a part of a sanctuary being looked after, and the value of life and the care that goes with that doesn't necessarily come into our language and accounting. And we wanted them to see the differences there and start to reflect on those differences, to think about accounting more holistically and how it could be opened up to more accountable ways of measuring. The fourth and last example we wanted to share was this idea of empathy as a dialogical bridge, that this is a way, if we can build accountants with empathy, we can start to create a different type of accounting environment. Obviously, that's geared towards clients, so we can start to think about the client relationship and the empathetic reasoning behind that. And that's definitely how we sell it inside the business school, for example. But there's more to it than that case. And thank you, Joe. The idea here with empathy is the ability for them to be able to empathize with other non-human species, so that when they are making these corporate decisions, they're using this information. Accountants won't hide behind the numbers anymore, because that's a significant problem we have. We have a language based on numbers, and it's very easy for us to step aside and say, well, hang on, the balance sheet says this. Now, when 10% of the company's value nowadays is on the balance sheet, it shows you we're 90% irrelevant. So we really need to start to rethink that kind of connection and discussions inside boardrooms. And so we hope that this empathy is a dialogical bridge. We use role playing a lot. So we use audit role play to be able to engage in that process. And I'll leave it there, and I'll pass back to Lisa to end the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And just to finish off with the presentation, so of course, this type of learning is just as much a journey of learning for the educators as it is for the students. Certainly, it's very different for the students to come into this type of learning environment when they're used to learning about debits and credits in accounting. So very much for educators, we also need a much more holistic mindset, and to be open to other types of learning, other ways of learning, and other roles that we play in ecological systems. So we acknowledge that this is an ongoing journey of learning for educators as much as it is for students. And it's also very important to think about approaches across disciplines, because accounting, of course, by itself can't address anything unless we work with others outside of accounting. So a transdisciplinary approach is really important for that. So thanks, everyone. I'll stop it there, and I'll stop sharing the screen. Happy to take them.
Yeah, fantastic. That's very interesting and really exciting. I've often thought about what could be done around accounting in business schools, but never found people who were as enthusiastic about the ideas. So really exciting to hear about. So we'll open up for some questions now. You're welcome to put your cameras on and speak. We're only a relatively small group, or if you feel more comfortable to put it into the chat, I can read those out for you if that works. So we've got about 10 minutes. Yeah, over to you guys. I guess if people are thinking about their questions, here we go. Okay, we've got, are you looking to reshape the course or curriculum and the language in it? Thank you, Supriya.
Thanks for the question. We would love to reshape the curriculum. At the moment, this is being done at the course and unit level. So we have these being done within different units within the accounting degree. I'm sure Nick would also love to completely reshape the accounting curriculum, but we're not quite in that position yet. And in terms of changing the language, we would also like to do that too, changing the language of accounting. And this is going to involve really educating the educators as much as educating the students.
So I'd like to come in there too. Lisa's got a good point. So it's a difficult, obviously you can imagine how difficult that is. But at the same time, accounting is dying as it currently is. And I do quite a lot of work with the International Federation of Accountants. and they know that we have a relevance issue globally. We can't attract young, diverse talent into our profession. It's really quite difficult because we don't have that purpose-driven proposition as yet. It's there, but we don't do it at a global level to the extent we need it. And so we've got a real opportunity right now to act really quickly to try to bring that sense of purpose into that model, and in doing so, shift the whole model globally. And I think what was the International Integrated Reporting Council, which is now the Value Creation Foundation, that is doing quite a lot of work to bring those things and integrate them together. So when we have the financials and the non-financials integrated in a more holistic decision-making, then we've got that opportunity. But as Lisa points, it's not so much about changing the curriculum before it is changing the educators themselves. And that's the bit that's probably the hardest part of the journey.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, the point in time issues there. I should have also said, if there's people in the room, I can see two people. I think one of them's Nick, who's a little far away. There is somebody else there. If you have a question, please do let us know as well. So, and we have another question off the chat here, which is similarly around the sort of, I suppose, the relationship with the business school itself, and whether there's a sort of more ecocentric accounting framework being applied there, or if you guys are, lone wolves, I suppose.
No, definitely not lone wolves. I mean, this kind of research has been done for the last, 3 or 4 decades. There's quite a body of work looking at this particular work. There's a lot of us, but I think what's unfortunate is that we're dispersed in different institutions. So in terms of the comparison between positivistic research and us, we're a relatively small minority across the world, but then there's about 2 or 3, or sometimes lucky you've got a whole unit of 6 or 7 inside one institution. So it makes it hard. So what we've recently done in the last 5 years is create these more global networks to bring us together, to make us stronger and pushing harder. We should not be underestimating the pandemic. The pandemic has had a huge shift in views globally amongst the business sector. And so we're hoping we can utilize that to create greater change.
And within your own business school, Nick and Lisa, is that the question was asking about that as well?
Yeah, 100%. So we have units dedicated to sustainability. We've also got majors dedicated to sustainability, and that's where we would fit in. There would be individuals interested in this because we've got the principles of responsible management education we signed up to. So we're in our early days of journey. So at Monash, we've sort of been doing that for the last 5 years. But it's definitely part of our operations, and it's part of our vision statement. Our Vice Chancellor's just released climate change is the #1 issue we're facing at the university. That's what we want to try to solve. So it's right through at every strategic level, including the business school.
Fantastic. Other questions? Bronwyn, I can see you champing at the bit.
Yeah, no, I just partly just want to thank you. I unfortunately missed the beginning. I was meant to be there if it wasn't for Anastasia. Although actually it does look odd, isn't it? Like this hybrid format. But anyway, it's exciting. And I had this vision of, I've got a comment and a question. I guess the comment was that kind of when you said that the competition is from, or the challenge to accounting and from a student recruitment point of view is the lack of a purpose-driven mission. And you can, one of the things that I'm really interested in is developing a purpose-driven mission through the parts of law. I'm a legal educator because that looks as if it's there. It looks as if they've got it sorted, but it's all human rights and criminal justice. But it's the private law, it's the corporate law part that there's so much potential, and many of the things you've identified sort of apply within law too there. And in fact, one of the Joe and I actually got this wonderful lawyer Janelle Orsi out years ago to speak around different cities, and she said the scariest audience, she's a lawyer, but the scariest audience she's ever spoken to in her life were corporate law academics. They were the most hostile. So it confirms what you've said. But I guess my question, so yeah, I've got this vision of, sort of configuring, project-driven internships, for example, that bring in law, accounting, and business students all around and show a different professional pathway and get people really excited, and then badge that as and you could do that potentially cross-institutionally, although I know it's a nightmare with our institutions. We're not really meant to collaborate, it seems sometimes. I mean, we're not set up actually to collaborate easily, but there are ways it can be done. And the question was just whether you feel competition for your students, not just from a more purpose-driven kind of alternative view of professional morality, if you like, but from the big, is it also the problem that the consulting firms are taking the interesting work? It's a slightly different angle question, but is that a challenge to the accounting profession, the consulting firms in general, or is that just a sort of, I don't know that I fully understand how accountants fit into consulting.
Lisa, did you want to talk to that?
I guess just to say something from the students' point of view, I guess the students come in and they want more. They want the purpose-driven curriculum, which they're not always getting, but that's what they want. Sometimes we find that when we get students into these units and doing these different types of learning innovations, that they can be quite, I guess, a bit fearful initially because it's something that they haven't done before. But then they usually grasp it quite quickly and then perform really well. So this is actually what the type of thing that they're looking for. And in terms of accounting firms are certainly saying that they want graduates with these types of skills, but it's a matter of how do we put this into the curriculum, given that they also want a certain level of technical knowledge as well, which is what the students are currently getting, mainly technical knowledge and less of these other more holistic thinking type of innovations.
Fascinating.
The large, I was going to say, the large four accounting firms in Australia have been employing artists and scientists and engineers and all types of backgrounds to be able to get some of these skills that we've failed them on. So that's been happening for quite some time. At the moment in Australia, we have a dire need for auditors and accountants. We're desperate. It's all through the media. They just can't get them. Ironically, because our borders have closed and they've shut down I guess they get a lot from Asia, who they pay in Asia, but they get to work in Australia. So there's a supply chain issue with our big four accounting firms.
Right.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I'm glad you brought the student perspective in there, Lisa. I was wondering how the students had taken to it, so that's very good. But we've got Janelle has her hand up. Janelle, would you like to ask a question or put it into the chat, whichever you prefer?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Nick and Lisa, for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. My question is around ESG. So I think the closest that the corporate world has gotten to any form of sustainable accounting is through this ESG framework, which, I mean, I personally think is still really anthropocentric, and it's still really removed. It still really, makes this really big distinction, or tries to sustain or perpetuate this distinction between human and nature. And I still think it doesn't do the job. But it's also the closest we've gotten to corporates recognizing the need for sustainability. And the best chance that we kind of have is the language that's most mainstream, it's most accepted. And if we are to make inroads, that is another way to go in through that avenue and change it from there. But then on the other hand, it's also so different as an approach to the approach that you've been talking about today. Can you talk a little bit about how you relate to this framework, or how if they're connected or unrelated, or where that fits for you guys?
Just a relatively the short version of the response, if you don't mind, so we can give Christine more time as well. Thank you.
So the ESG framework relies on disclosure. That's pretty much what it is. So it's really disclosing information, right? The closest thing we have to a more advanced way of doing this in accounting is what is called integrated reporting. And that brings it brings the six capitals together in a more integrated way. Now, the problem we have globally is that our accounting solution to do that was to turn every 5 capitals into a financial dollar value. So therefore, all you're doing is perpetuating the current system, and you're just creating different markets, and you're creating more value across the long term. The solution would be if we remove the financials, and I know that sounds scary as an accountant, but if we remove the financials out of it, everything else is a physical capital. It's a physical flow of resources. And if we just got the numbers, the financial information out of the equation, others would integrate together. And it's the integrated thinking that is driven by the integrated reporting that could be the closest thing we'll get to global change in corporations. We know if we can get boards to think integratedly, the better decision-making is happening for the short, medium, and long term. And the better they will do in terms of performance and decisions that they make in the organization.
Mm.
So again,
Fantastic.
It's behavior, and it goes back to education.
Fantastic. Oh, this is so exciting. This is yeah, looking for these kinds of conversation for some time. So thank you very much, Nick and Lisa. And I'm sure that if people would like to know more, they could find you via your institution. I think you're with Monash University, is that right? Yes, so thank you very much for being involved, and look forward to looking up some of your work afterwards and having a look as well. So now we're going to pass it over to Christine McDougall. Christine's going to be our second panelist today. I will let you introduce yourself, Christine, and just let me know if you would need any help with sharing or anything like that. I think, Nick, have you given Christine host rights as well?
Share, yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, you're good. Okay, great. So I'll give you a 1 minute mark you asked for. So and off we go. Great.
Thank you. Doing such a beautiful job. I would like to acknowledge the land I'm on, which is Yukon Bear country on the Gold Coast, and elders past and present. And I also want to say, Lisa and Nick, what an amazing, I just love what you're doing. It's so exciting. So thank you so much for your beautiful work. The work that I'm doing is the alternate university of the world. Syntropic World, which is the enterprise that I am the chief steward founder of, is a global education platform where we're literally rethinking, redesigning how we coordinate humans for a world with a future for Earth and all her creatures. And so the word syntropic is the opposite to entropic or entropy. Entropy is for the second law of thermodynamics and means that we're in a degenerative universe. And syntropic, a term coined by my mentor of over 30 years, Buckminster Fuller, is towards an eternally regenerative universe. So syntropic essentially means leaving everything _better. And so we are rethinking, redesigning everything, legal codes, Bronwyn, accounting for value, how we coordinate humans, how we do leadership, how we think about community, long-term thinking, everything is up for examination. And so it's essentially a grassroots, let's change all of the systems and do that by building models that make the existing models obsolete. It's a very bold initiative. We have graduates now in 24 countries around the world. So just a little bit of a backstory here. I mentioned Buckminster Fuller. For those of you who are not familiar with his work, he dedicated his life to understanding the laws of universe, laws of nature, and how to apply them to everything. Now, his predominant work was in the built environment, but he looked at economy, he looked at legal codes, he looked at everything. But the majority of his work was building houses and cars and cities and constructs. And I'm talking 50, 70 years ago, that used the minimal amount of material, maximum efficiency. And one of the first things he did in 1927, so this is in the very early days of, I wasn't around then, so I have no vision of it, but in the early days of cars on roads, he looked at the all-in accounting cost of a barrel of oil in 1927. And the all-in accounting cost, which reverts to some of the beautiful work that you're doing, Lisa and Nick, took into consideration the cost for our Mother Earth to create the oil over billions of years. The creatures, the animals, the decomposting, everything, all of that. And then he also looked at the cost that we know well of humans finding, extracting, refining, using oil. And then he also looked at the post-use cost, which we are dealing with. And he said in 1927 that there wasn't a single human on the planet, not a single human on the planet that could afford a single barrel of oil in 1927, and that eventually we would be paying the after tax of our lack of accounting consideration. So the tool I'm presenting in a very short space of time, which I usually take a minimum of an hour to give a first cut version, is a tool called the Synergestic Accounting or Synergistic Audit. And it is based on one of Bucky's models, which is the 12 degrees of freedom. Now, he did a lot of work in geometry. I'm going to show this, just don't get complicated, but this is a vector equilibrium. It's a geometrical structure. And we've based the synergistic accounting on the 12 degrees of freedom, which is the most effective and efficient way to stabilize any system. What that means is that we have a minimum, we have 6 inputs and 6 outputs. And all of those things would live on the equivalent of what we would call a balance sheet. I'm going to go through the categories briefly in a moment. But the work that, sort of, to get to this place, I've spent most of my life convening people, bringing people together. And of course, if we're going to solve some of the world's biggest problems, we have to bring people together. And I've had the most amazing privilege of bringing people together around amazing projects. And for 30 years, having those projects fall into a messy human heap. I'm not sure if any of you have been in a messy human heap, but that's where egos and agendas and off-puts and all of that sort of stuff, even with beautiful humans holding a gorgeous purpose, and it can get messy. And then 6 years ago on this day, the 5th of November, remember the 5th of November, we held an event on the Gold Coast called Big Blue Sky, which was, its purpose was to bring community together to co-create the future of our city. And in the establishment of that, I used the Synergistic Accounting tool and what we have as well, which is called the Trust Manifesto, which is the social and enterprise architecture. And what this enabled was it enabled a group of 12 complete strangers to co-create a world-class event in 6 months without a single human upset and entirely self-managed. And I can report that the feedback from the crew behind the event felt the most edified and honoured that they've ever felt in their lives, because the principles that live behind Syntropic is zero exploitation, zero extraction to extinction, zero colonisation, zero domination. And so my journey into considering value has been lifelong, including a deep fall down the rabbit hole of understanding money, value, accounting, capital, finance, flows, currency, complementary currency. I've had the good fortune of training with people who are genius in complementary currencies and so on. And as a single mother, an entrepreneurial single mother, experiencing many times that the value that I was bringing was either not recognized, not seen, not accounted for, ignored, or not paid for. And so this exploitation impulse, there's no one I know actually that has ever not felt exploited to some degree. What the Synergistic Accounting tool enables is it enables us to bring all value to the table. So let me just show you briefly. Synergistic accounting's purpose is to increase the degrees of freedom for an increased number of days forward for all life, and so this is why I love, Lisa and Nick, your presentation when you're looking at animals, creatures, etc., etc. The increased degrees of freedom goes back to the 12 degrees of freedom. And so these are the domains that we use. And I'm just going to show you how we do this. So there's a positive and a negative input. This is actually a flat map of this same structure that I just showed you. So don't get, you don't need to get into the complexity of that. But one of the domains is matter. Currency, which is any of the flow states, which includes money, debt, etc., etc. Tools and artifacts. This can be language. It can be tools that we know, physical tools, etc., etc. Knowledge shared, knowledge held without being shared is nothing. It doesn't have a value. Knowledge shared. Warm data. This is a beautiful term that was coined by Nora Bateson. Warm data is the stuff that lives between relationships. It's the liminal space. It's the care, love, beauty, respect, the multidimensionality that is invisible, immeasurable, weightless, that lives between relationships, and well-being. So we have positive and negative inputs of both of those, of all of those. So what we do in the synergistic audit, which if anyone's interested, you're welcome to get a copy of this. It's just and anything that we create is a template. We put it in the Creative Commons. It is not fixed, therefore it's mutable, it's changeable, it's emergent. But the synergistic audit is a questioning process that goes through these 12 domains. But how we do this, let's just say that you and I were working on a project. Even if it's a small project, we're working on a project. The opening question of the audit is, what do you have the capacity, willingness, and desire to bring to this project in these 6 domains? So you get sovereign choice. What do you have the capacity, willingness, and desire to bring? And for that bringing, what do you expect in return in the same 6 domains? Currency or money can only ever occupy 1/6 of the input. So if you're bringing 100% of the money, you don't get 100% of anything, you get 1/6. Because the moment we give currency, money, the moment we give any domain dominance over the other, we're automatically diminishing the love and care that someone brings to an enterprise and giving it a irrelevance. And as Lisa and Nick mentioned, this is clearly also created so that some things can never be converted to a dollar value, because the moment we do that, we debase the experience. So for example, we cannot attempt to convert the experience of parents being present to the birth of their child into a dollar value. There is a debasement of humanity when we do that. And so there are some domains that we need to hold the value in the domain it was expressed. There are others that we can transfer. But the question, what do you have the capacity, willingness, and desire to bring, and what do you expect in return? In the design of that, we're creating as well a structure that enables humans to grow up and develop, because most of us, in my experience, have either an issue with naming their value or seeing it or recognizing it, and or asking for their value to be acknowledged. Some people want their value to be acknowledged in warm data, or warm data and knowledge. They don't necessarily need currency. Some people might need more currency, and they might need stuff, a house, a place, a car to drive, a computer. And so when we create this multi-dimensional way of acknowledging value, and I'm not just talking about human value, and we never allow any one level of value to take precedence over the other, it opens a space, incredible, gorgeous things to happen. People feel seen and heard in their wholeness. number one. As I said, people get to grow up because if within a team, and we have design for that as well, but within a team, if someone is bringing way more value, then they've nominated because there's a lot of sovereign choice in here, nominated, then Joe might say, Christine, you're bringing way more value than you've nominated. I think you deserve to get something else. We create the space for those robust type of conversations. The other thing that happens here is from a, and I hate the word, so from a traditional human resources perspective, we're not human resources, by the way, but a human input perspective, when we map this out, you can see the richness that people have that almost any job interview will not evidence, but you'll also see what's not there, what we need. If we need to provision, then rather than going, we need 100,000, we go, if we had the 100,000, what would we spend it on? And we do the audit. And then we also do the audit for what we have in our ecosystem. And there's an intrinsic belief in syntropic world that if we're provisioning the very next step, not the 10th step, the very next step, what we need, which is not always and rarely actually money, will be in the field. So I'm looking at the time. Is there anything else that I wanted to cover? This is a working model. It has been applied, as I said. We've got teams around the world that are applying this yeah, it's just been an incredibly gorgeous experience. It's a work in motion. Your audit, by the way, is mutable, which means that if it changes, and it can change overnight, that you as the person that has created the audit are responsible for communicating to whoever's going to be affected by the change. So if you suddenly have no time because your daughter is an emergency for this project, you tell whoever needs to know. The system adapts. It's a living, breathing enterprise. There you go, Joe.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christine. That's great. So we do have some time for some discussion and questions then, which is terrific. Probably about 6 or 7 minutes. So I'll turn it over to the floor if anybody's got a question or a comment or a thought for Christine. And same as before, if you want to put your talk or put your hand up or put in the chat, we'll bring your question forward. So perhaps I ask a question to get things going. Christine, I'm interested in, so you talked about people implementing this. Who are you working with? What sort of, what's in it? Can you give us an example of how,
yes,
of something that's happened in practice?
Yeah. So I mentioned Big Blue Sky, which was 6 years ago today, but we have literally got teams all around the world that are now implementing this in all of their enterprises. So we've got a team that just presented at COP overnight, the Art of the Forest, and they've implemented this throughout their system. They're based out of Tanzania. We've got a global, based on the Gold Coast, but global enterprise that has applied this as well to their stuff. I mean, it's everywhere that I'm working, it's there because it's such a powerful tool. You actually have to do the process to understand the process. It's not, this is, the audit itself is going through the audit, an inquiry base is a really powerful experience. And the other thing that happens when you do that, when you speak it out loud with each other as a team, it's one of the most profoundly connecting, witnessing experiences that people have had when they go through their audit. Obviously, there is a choice factor here as how much they share as well. But yeah, so we've got a lot of companies planetary care in the United States, a lot of regenerative agriculture companies and so on that are using this.
Thanks. And is it normally within an organisation, or is it something that happens between organisations? Or
if you can apply it to both. When I did Big Blue Sky, I took the sponsors who had no awareness of this. I took the sponsors through this process. What I would do is I sit down with them and say, what do you have the capacity, willingness and desire for your sponsorship to bring? And I would ask them questions around each of these categories. And then once we got that, I would then go, and for that, what are you expecting in return? And I would ask them through these categories. And that created the document, which was more nuanced and more rich than most sponsors had ever been asked before. But it also created the opportunity for us to go back in 6 weeks and say, how are you going? Are you happy with what you're bringing? And how are we responding from, you know, what you expected in return? So it creates this gorgeous relational dynamic in its structure itself.
Oh, that's great. That really helped bring it to life. Thank you. Others, comments, questions? Bronwyn.
Well, I'm very intrigued. I mean, I'd like to find out more. I mean, do you have any contact with, well, I guess 2 questions. Do you get particular typical resistances or criticisms that you've become familiar with kind of responding to, and what would they be? And is there any engagement with education and students?
A lovely question, Ron. We're just researching bringing the Syntropic Enterprise Masterclass. It's literally just come to life into Tanzania. We've got a very active community in Tanzania, my focus literally is, and this is just at this stage of my life, I've decided that I'm going to focus on what we can do. For a world with a future for Earth and all her creatures. And so I know this works. I know when I see what happens to people when they're working in this framework. I see what happens to our consideration. I see what happens when we loosen the shackles from, if but for the money, we could do this. I see all of this every day of my life. And so I have no doubt that there are people that are entrenched in very traditional structures that would have a lot to say about this. What I know for sure is that when people feel truly valued and there is an opportunity to bring their whole selves and to acknowledge that we live in an interconnected universe and that what we do has an effect on everything, when that's built into the system of how we come together as humans in enterprise, the dignity and the respect and the extraordinary opening for humans to bring their best selves. I don't need anyone, I don't mind, anyone can tell me what they think, but mine doesn't work. So that's where I spend my time, with people.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a great note to finish on. I've just had the warning that we've got the next group coming in onto this call for the next session. So unfortunately, we do need to wrap up quite promptly. But what a lovely note to finish on. Thank you, Christine, and thank you to Nick and Lisa.
A lovely panel. Thank you.
Yeah, and a great discussion. And look, hopefully people will connect and find out a little more about some of those super interesting work that you guys are all involved in as well. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming, and thanks for your questions. And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for beautiful facilitation, Jo. Lovely.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah.
Take care.
Do we leave?